Welcome, everyone. My name is Marlone Henderson. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology here at UT Austin. Lucky to be moderating this awesome panel with these three experts. So I just have a little intro here that I've already shared with the panelists, and then a few questions that I will kind of turn over to them as we go through. So our primary duties in higher education involve teaching and doing research. A key aspect of our mission as teachers and researchers is to prepare students to be successful in life. Part of what it means to be successful is knowing how to talk to people who disagree with us, for example, at work, at home, even on dates. Given the ever-increasing divisiveness that exists in society, some might argue that we as educators could be doing a better job fulfilling our mission. Indeed, some estimates suggest partisan hostility is at a record high, with many people seeing the quote-unquote other side as immoral or evil. Moreover, we see increased rates of people exclusively affiliating with others who share their political views, with people also avoiding those who hold more moderate views, both of which seem to contribute to an inability or unwillingness to communicate with others who hold divergent views. And all of this contributes to the motivation for this panel, right? To really try to understand how can we, as a society, do better in terms of actually communicating, getting along with people who don't necessarily agree with us. So my first question that I'm going to throw to the panel is this true that people seem to be struggling to communicate with others who disagree with them? Is this something that's unique to the political kind of times we're in right now? Is this something more general? Is this something that's unique to just this time, or is this something essential about just people living in groups? And I think we'll start with Mina, and then we'll just kind of go in that direction that way. So thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me. My name is Mina Cikara, and I'm a professor of psychology, and I study intergroup conflict and relations. So I'm thrilled to be a part of this panel with my fabulous colleagues. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with all of you and hear your questions as well. So I guess what I would say in response to this first question is that I think people have a hard time with hard conversations in general. It doesn't matter that it's about politics per se, but I do think that politics has taken center stage recently because we have so much more access to people's political identities now, maybe, than we have historically. And so I kind of want to take a step back and think about this not necessarily in the context of politics, but more broadly. I think anytime moral issues are on the table, it has a potential to get incredibly heated, in large part because anytime we disagree with somebody, the easiest explanation for why we don't think the same things is just that they're immoral. And so oftentimes we stop there. We stop at the content of their beliefs, and we don't necessarily interrogate how it is that they came to hold those beliefs in the first place. Then you layer groups on top of that and people's stereotypes and beliefs about groups, and that makes the shortcut even shorter, I would argue. So we don't need to know a lot about a person beyond their political identity before we start to make a lot of assumptions about their beliefs, their priorities, their values, and their preferences. And so I think what's difficult about it is that it's not true, that's not necessarily true for all groups. There are lots of groups where we have collaborative relationships across group boundaries, or at least neutral relationships, but politics is inherently competitive. And I would say it's that competitive aspect that really, the competitive aspect, but also that our beliefs about other people's welfare and our morals really are integral to the conversation that makes these kinds of conversations much harder to have. So while I would say that it's the case that politics could be cast as more collaborative, we understand that, the sort of keystone experience, or like the thing that we think about the most as voters, is elections, and those are inherently competitive. There's a world in which once people are elected to office, they get to Washington and they become collaborative in the service of the American people, for example, in the US context. But I think that given recent historical shifts in gerrymandering and how competitive elections have become, it's a lot harder for people to shift out of that competitive mindset and into the collaborative mindset. And that then trickles down to how it is that voters interact with one another. So that's kind of all over the place, but that's how I wanted to make the connection between difficulty having moral conversations, the role of competition, and how it might play out in politics.
Great, thanks. So I'm Levendusky, I'm a political scientist. So the thing that I thought about when thinking about how to answer this question was that we have a lot of misperceptions about people who are unlike us, right? And so that's true across lots of things, nothing unique about politics there. But I think this is politically relevant, picking up something Mina said, that we know a lot about people's political identities in a way that we wouldn't have a long time ago, right? Or even not that long ago, 20 or 30 years ago, right? So think about, the way in which media coverage has increasingly become centered around political elites. So I have a student who wrote a nice dissertation some years ago about how even issues like climate change or gun control were one time dominated by non-political experts. Now increasingly the voices that news media choose to center in the coverage of those issues are people who are either political activists or elected officials, right? So making everything into a political issue rather than like, oh, this is an issue about X. No, everything becomes about politics. And so I think the other thing we could think about there certainly is the role of social media, right? So there would normally be no reason for me to know my barber's politics, right? But if I follow him on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, right, I might often see those sorts of things. And the same thing would be true of, say, like someone I went to high school with but haven't spoken to in 25 years, right? That gives me access to all these things. So I start to then form a set of perceptions of what people on the other side look like. But one thing we know is that those perceptions are often quite inaccurate, right? So I think that makes this conversation harder because people might think about the most extreme version of the other side instead of what might look like a more typical version of the other side. So as Kristen said on the panel right before lunch, right, most people are somewhere in the middle. They have a lot of really kind of complex issues, right? One of the favorite things I like to teach students when we talk about public opinion is that most Americans think the term pro-life and pro-choice apply to them quite well, right? Most people are quite complex on abortion, but that's often missing from a lot of the dialogue and discussion we have around these issues. So that'll be something I'll come back to and pick up on in the responses to some of the later questions.
Yeah, I'll try to build on the last two comments. My name is Jay Van Bavel. I'm a professor of psychology and neuroscience at New York University. And a quote that kind of sums up the way that I think about this problem is from evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson, who said, "The real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And it is terrifically dangerous and is now approaching a point of crisis overall." And what he's essentially saying is that we have these really ancient brains, and they're plopped down in a world where our institutions are struggling to manage with the challenges that we're facing as humans. And then we're plopped in the challenge of facing all these additional technological innovations. You mentioned social media. Another one is like artificial intelligence and large language models. And so I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about my research on social media, which looks at polarization and conversations online. And a lot of what we're finding, and many other researchers are finding, is that the design and the algorithms and incentives of that environment, which now 5 billion people around the world are on social media. The average user is online for about 3 hours a day. And I always like this statistic. This is about 6 inches high. The average user of social media scrolls through 300 feet of content a day. That's 600 swipes down. That's the height of the Statue of Liberty. That's the length of reading the New York Times end to end 4 times over each day. And so we don't have time to read all of that. I don't have time to read the New York Times even in a given day. It takes me all week to get through just the weekend editions. So what's happening there? So a lot of that content is fighting for our attention. And what that means is that certain content is popping out more and grabbing our attention more. And the platforms that are sharing the content have an incentive to amplify content that grabs our attention and keeps us online, because that's how they sell advertisements and make money. And so what they do, what the algorithms seem to do, there was a recent paper that came out analyzing Twitter and X's algorithm. And what they find is that it's if you look at the algorithmic feed versus just the feed of the people you decided to follow, the algorithmic feed is sharing far more content that is full of moral emotions, like Mina mentioned, and is full of outrage and is polarizing. And what our research has found over and over and over again on many, many topics, including same-sex marriage, gun control, climate change, two of the ones you mentioned, is that for every moral emotional word you put in a post, it's 20% more likely to get shared. If you put 4 or 5 words like that in a post you share on social media, it is twice as likely to get shared. And so it's a really good strategy for winning the attention economy and building a following, getting your message out, getting likes, driving engagement, getting followers. But when we looked at who's sharing it, what we found is that when you use that language to talk about these political issues, you get echo chambers. That's what is associated with polarization. And when we've brought people into lab and we've just like experimentally manipulated when they see a political message with that language versus with more toned down neutral language, they perceive the person using that language as more hyper-partisan and more closed-minded, and they don't want to engage with them. And so that language is getting incentivized and rewarded, and you're feeling the rewards. What you don't often see is a mass of eye rolls of people who could otherwise be open-minded or persuaded to you, but now don't want to engage with you. And then I'll say another challenge of social media. I'll give you 3 statistics, and then I'll turn it back to Marlone. This gives you a sense of who you're seeing when you scroll through that 300 feed of newsfeed a day. A mere 0.1% of users are responsible for sharing 80% of fake news. So if we're talking about the misinformation, conspiracy theory, fake news problem, that is 1%, a percentage of 1%, 0.1%. 70% of all online conflicts begin in just 1% of online communities. So the hostility is being generated by a very small set of groups. And only 3% of social media accounts are scored as toxic, but they produce over 1/3 of the toxic content. So what you're seeing online when you're seeing conflict is coming from the most extreme people who are responding to these incentives, and they're overrepresented. And so it creates false norms in our mind about what the average person believes, and goes to Matt's point, that we misunderstand what the average person of any given group thinks because we're only seeing content or overrepresentation of the content from the most extreme, most hostile, most toxic, most information-spewing segment of those communities.
I had a follow-up question to this for all of you. So it's related to the scope of this. So these issues that you all are bringing up, is this something that varies across communities within the United States? Is this something unique to the United States? Do we see something similar outside of the United States? I didn't give him that question ahead of time. I wanted to catch him off guard.
I mean, I don't even think it's specific to politics, right? It depends on what context you're in, what the sort of social fissure is. Can you hear us? Is that better? Okay, very good. I don't think it's necessarily even about politics. Different contexts will have different either religious schisms or, ethnic and racial schisms. And so I think that any time you have these sort of group dynamics where all of these cognitive shortcuts with which humans are all imbued, we tend to focus on bad news better than any other kind of news because that has been adaptive in our evolutionary history. Things that are familiar seem to be much more likely. So if we've been exposed to a history of stereotypes and propaganda, those things that conform to those things as opposed to those things that run against those things, those stereotypes are the ones that we think are more real and that are stickier in our minds. So I don't think that it's necessarily specific to politics or the US. I would say that it's a more general phenomenon having to do with attention, what it is that we think we need to pay attention to keep ourselves safe, and group dynamics. But I'm curious what you both think.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I think about sometimes as a political scientist is there are pluses and minuses to the party system. So there's this phenomenon of affective polarization where people dislike the other side. It's partly related to issues, but partly related to deeper things. And if you look at that same concept in a lot of European multi-party systems, it's not that it doesn't exist, it does, but it has a very different form, and mostly what it is there is that people don't like really far radical right parties. But if you ask a, say, like social democrat how they feel about a Christian Democrat, they're kind of like, yeah, whatever. Whereas most, Democrats really dislike most other Republicans. And I think one kind of weird feature of the US is the kind of nature of the two-party system makes the conflict like I win, you lose. So a book I like to teach to undergrads is this book by Francis Lee called Divided Majorities, and the point of the book is basically like part of the reason why congressional politics look so nasty and dysfunctional is because if you look, for example, at the House of Representatives right now, Republicans have like a 3-seat majority. That's why Elise Stefanik, they're slow rolling her confirmation because they want to keep her vote in the House. So it's sort of like, if you're the Democrats, it's like, okay, well, you don't have much incentive, right, to kind of work with the Republicans. You're like, no, I want them to screw up so that in 2026, we become the majority party, right? So that kind of very narrow kind of divisions within a two-party system is just a particularly bad way of thinking about this.
Yeah, I'll add to that one of the limitations is a lot of the research that's been done on these topics has been in America. And so there's a need for a lot more research around the world. We're just actually about to launch a study in like 20 or 30 countries, depending on how much money we can get, if there's grants at the end of this conference. And the goal is to look at the impact of these technologies in other countries, especially in other continents that haven't been studied very well. So we can actually like draw proper comparisons. And that gives you a sense then of what is the impact just of the technology per se, and what might be, in the way that I currently think of it, is that the current intergroup dynamic and polarization and those types of things in America are already, the fire is already going, and then the technology is just like an accelerant. It's like pouring gasoline on an already existing fire. I don't think that the technology here started any of this. I think it's just an accelerant. And so I think it will play out differently depending on the intergroup conflicts in different places, as Mina mentioned. But we really do need to study it a lot more to know exactly what the variables are causing what. I think that's like not well known enough by scientists.
Thank you, yes. Each of you does research that can tell us something about how we can talk to people who disagree with us. You've touched on this a little bit. What does your work say about solutions, interventions, positive steps, you can frame it however you want, that we can enact to help people navigate difficult conversations and truly communicate with people who disagree with them? And I'll tack on something I've been thinking more about is, are we just hoping for tolerance? Is there something more hopeful, more positive that we can achieve as a society? Was there a point in time where we had that and we lost it? So trying to speak to that if you can. And take whichever order. I hate to always be like, Mina, you go first. Okay.
Yeah, I'll jump in.
Okay.
So some of the relevant research that I do is how it is that these sort of competitive intergroup contexts really distort our beliefs about the other side. So not just what we think they think, but specifically what we think they think about us. And what we find very reliably is that in competitive contexts, we make all manner of wildly negative attributions to them relative to how they actually feel about us. And one of the reasons that this is important is because this is yet another accelerant, I think. It's from just a purely game theoretic perspective. If I think they hate us and everything that we do, that forecloses on the possibility of collaboration. It puts me in a vulnerable position to continue to try, actually. It puts me in a bad position, strategically speaking. And so these misbeliefs and these misperceptions, like Matt had referred to them, I think are incredibly powerful, because even if we don't personally have ill will towards the other side in whatever kind of a conflict we're discussing, I'm going to be motivated to maintain some sort of ill will, or at least have negative intentions towards them to protect myself and our interests. That's just rational. One of the things that I find helpful about thinking of what we find in our research is that if we correct people's misperceptions on this count, we say, okay, you guessed that the other political party would be opposed to what your political party did, 100% of, if you're a Democrat, 100% of Republicans would be opposed to what the Democrats just did. But actually, we polled a bunch of Republicans, and it turns out only half of them would be opposed, or they wouldn't be opposed to the degree that you believe. They're sort of lukewarm on the idea. What we find is that then actually changes people's beliefs about their negative intents on other things. So what that suggests to us is that there's a whole complex of beliefs that we have about the other side, and we're going to respond to them in a somewhat rational fashion. But if those beliefs are overly pessimistic, we have a problem, right? Because that's just that's a conflict spiral that escalates over time. And the good news about correcting meta-perceptions is that there are two things. One, it's just about increasing accuracy. I'm not lying to participants when I'm intervening. I'm not telling them anything that isn't actually true about the world. I'm just giving them more accurate perceptions about what it is that on average the other side believes. So that's one thing I like about it. The other thing is it's good news. And there are very few things that constitute good news in politics right now. I think when we give them information that the other side isn't nearly as hateful towards them as they thought, people are relieved. It has a chance to land. We're not telling them you're wrong about them or trying to dispel their stereotypes, which it turns out is incredibly difficult to do. People like to hold on to their stereotypes. But we're giving them good news. They actually like and respect you more than you thought. And that is why I think that one of those, that kind of information actually has potentially a chance to land. The last thing I'll say is it's not just about how they feel about us, it's also what we expect them to do. So there's lots of really beautiful work now across political psychology and political science and social psychology, finding that if you dispel the belief that the other side is particularly inclined to engage in political violence, if you tell them actually very few people would support this, that turns down the temperature on people's own preferences for political violence and democratic backsliding. And so it's not just about feelings, it's also about strategic behavior. And I think that that's, again, incredibly important because what we need to do is reduce the effects of these accelerants.
Yeah. So I want to build on some of that and think about 3 different strategies that are like quite practical things that I like to tell folks. I don't, not normal Americans, but non-academics, I guess, when I talk about these things. So I've done some work. I wrote a book on kind of reducing animosity. A lot of it centers on cross-party dialogue. And so I took away a couple of broader lessons from that. And the first one is that listening is more important than speaking. So we tend to really value kind of speaking as like, no, we need to have our opinion out there. But one of the things I really learned from that was that you get a lot out of listening carefully to other people. And I think that the key point there is listening to understand, right? So kind of trying to understand someone else's point of view, why they feel the way that they feel and why they think the way that they think, and to try and pick up on that to get a better sense of their point of view. The second thing is that when you're looking for these conversations, I think they tend to go better if you try to cut against the grain rather than go with it, right? So if I'm a Democrat and I'm talking to a Republican, if I just say like, why won't you just admit that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, right? That kind of creates a bit of a defensive barrier because I'm saying something that even if you sort of, you might think, okay, yeah, that's probably sort of true, but it's this identity marker, and so I'm asking you to give up something quite valuable about yourself. If instead I say something like, what's a time when your party really disappointed you and you wish they'd done something different? That kind of opens up space in a different way for conversation that's a lot more constructive. And the third thing, picking up on a theme we talked about this morning, have humility and be willing to extend grace to other people, right? So one of the things as I've thought about how to do some of this with students, right? One of the things that we really emphasized is something that came up at dinner last night is thinking about what some of the ground rules are. And one of the things I say to students is you need to extend grace to other people so that other people will in turn extend grace to you, right? Because one of the benefits of getting someone older is that you realize that you will screw up, right? So that you need other people to forgive you. So in return, you extend them that same courtesy. So I think that if you think about how maybe to have interactions in a more productive way, right? It doesn't mean they're always going to go well, right? They still fail, right? This is hard to do, right? But there are things you can do that might make it more likely that they come out well.
Yeah, I'll add a few things to this. The first is that people are often surprised how much they enjoy talking to people, whether those are strangers or people they disagree with. And there's been lots of studies on this in psychology. For example, like randomly assigning people to talk to someone on their morning commute. Turns out they enjoy the day a little bit more if they actually sparked a conversation, even though they don't expect that they would enjoy it. And people have the same experience if they have a conversation with someone that they might otherwise expect to disagree with. It turns out that they are often surprised and they find that there's a lot more common ground than they expected. And one of the problems of the misperceptions that Mina mentioned is that when we have stereotypes about a group, and this is not just, we're talking about political groups here, but I want to apply this to the first panel. We talked about religious groups. We can also talk about racial groups. There's all kinds of groups in society where if you have a negative stereotype, if you have a positive stereotype about them, you think they're good people, nice people, they agree with you, you'll actually reach out and interact with them, and then you could be proven wrong. You could find out that someone is actually not as positive as you expect, and you can update your belief. But if you have a negative stereotype about a group, that will lead you to avoid interacting with everybody in that group, and therefore you can't be proven wrong, and therefore you're immune to updating your beliefs. And so it's actually really important to understand that negative stereotypes can be immune to disproof because of their nature leads us to avoid interacting with people who could actually give us information that would be really critical for us to changing and evolving our belief about them. So that's one of the that's the way you get in this vicious cycle of like, you just continue to read negative things about them and you never have an opportunity to get it debunked. The other thing I will say that's really critical, and this dates back to the 1950s, is that if you can put people together and find a common goal or a common in-group identity, that is one of the most proven ways to help build grounds for connection. And that can be, Mina and I have even done research on this. That can be like working together in a competition. It can be like cheering for the local football team. It could be, state pride. It can be national pride when you watch the Olympics. All of these things are sources of broader identities that are more inclusive and allow us to feel a sense of connection to people who otherwise are different to us. And it turns out there was a recent tournament called the Strengthening Democracy Challenge, and it was run out of a set of our colleagues and collaborators at Stanford, and they invited people to submit interventions to reduce affective polarization and strengthen, bolster democracy. They had 252 submissions from around the globe, from scientists and scholars. I read your interventions too. And the one that my lab submitted was about like reminding people they share a common identity as Americans and they have a history of shared norms and values. And that dramatically reduced affective polarization, and it lasted for several weeks. And so you might think it feels like these things are immune to being changed, but that was a research where it was randomly assigned to 32,000 Americans, and it worked really well. It had a really strong effect size and persisted. And it also spilled over to bolster their support for democracy. So there are types of things that we can do that are grounded in 70 years of research that can apply to all kinds of group conflicts. That can be part of any conversation, that you can find that common ground first and can help create a more germane basis for a conversation about other topics where there might be differences. Okay, I'll add one more way to deal with it. Now, I'll go back to social media since I opened with that problem and how it's kind of has incentive structures for extreme people and extreme perspectives. We figured, okay, well, can we get people to unfollow, a dozen of these extreme people? And so we identified the most hyper-polarizing accounts on social media. It was on Twitter or X. It was on Twitter and then it became X because Elon Musk took it over halfway through our study. But we followed people for about a year. And for the first month, we paid them, I think it was $20, to just unfollow about 10 to a dozen of these more extreme accounts that they were following. And then we measured how polarized they were, how much they hated people from the other political party. And what we found is that just simply unfollowing about 10 to a dozen of these accounts reduced their feelings of polarization by 24%. And then we said, this is the best part, then we said the study's over, just like most of our studies, and we said you can refollow these accounts if you want, go back about resuming your diet of social media however you like. And then we followed up with them at 3 months and 6 months and a year later. And what we found is that the intervention still worked. And I was actually pretty shocked by this, is that they were still less polarized months later. And this almost never happens with psychology interventions. Usually you change somebody's mindset, it helps in the moment, and then the day later, a week later, they go back to normal because they're refed the same diet of news and elite messaging they get in the world. But what had happened is when the study was over and we gave them their money and said you could refollow these extreme accounts if you want to, the majority of people did not want to. And so they permanently changed their information diet. And it's just analogous to if you permanently change your diet to be something more healthy, you stop eating at McDonald's every single day, and you start eating somewhere healthy, and then I say at the end of the month, okay, you can go back to McDonald's, you might decide, actually, I'm feeling better, I don't want to go back there and eat that stuff now. And they kept their new information diet, and the people who kept that diet were less polarized for a year later. And then we ran another study where we gave them a different condition where we said, okay, we're going to pay you to follow someone different. And so we paid them to follow science accounts, like the NASA account and the Discover Channel account. And so it was pictures of like the James Webb Telescope of black holes and poison dart frogs in the Amazon. And now people had a positive emotional experience of being on social media. And so you can change how they feel about other groups. You can change how they feel about their own well-being. by just changing that diet a little bit. And I think we often underestimate how much content we're consuming on here. And so I'm just going to give a little experiment in this class. We'll just see. How many people picked up their phone first things in the morning? Raise your hand and then look around the room. So about half of the room. How many people checked it right before they went to bed? Put your hand way up, don't be shy. Our whole panel almost did, 75% of us. This happens like every room I go into, and so it's like most of your conscious experience is infected with the diet of information that you're getting from the moment you fall asleep to the first moment when you open your eyes and wake up. And so that's the experience for a lot of people. And so if you change what that information is that you're receiving and make it a little less hostile, a little less toxic, a little less full of like stereotypes that pick on certain groups, then you're gonna find that you might feel a little better and you might be feeling a little less hostile towards those groups. And it doesn't take much. This was like, instead of taking a sledgehammer and just like banning it or deleting the app, it was taking a scalpel and just carving out those things that were actually harming their perceptions of the world.
Thank you. So I thought I'd turn to some of the questions coming in here because it relates to some of the topics that have come up regarding changing people's perceptions or becoming more accurate in how they understand other people's understanding. You touched on issues, Jay, I believe you specifically touched on issues related to social media and how they're the algorithms that they're feeding. So I thought this question was related to it. So it says, there is an effort to erode the idea of truth nowadays. If we don't have a sense of truth, how can we agree or disagree? Aren't we reduced to epistemological goo? And so, yeah, I think this is a great question because a lot of times, as we said, these disagreements maybe aren't based on reality or an accurate understanding of things, but there are forces out there that are financially motivated, and maybe we can speak to some other motivations they might have to, like if they're coming from other countries, for example, these efforts to foster disagreement. And a lot of times that is based on things like the spread of misinformation. So I wonder if you all could speak to this issue of like the question of, if we don't have a sense of truth, how can we get to a better understanding? That's something I've heard you all speak to, or agreement. If that is a goal, should that be a goal? So,
Yeah, I guess we didn't tackle the question of like what is normatively desirable with these interventions.
Yeah.
Maybe we should do that really quickly. I mean, this is a question that anyone who studies polarization has to ask themselves. What is the outcome you actually want to achieve? Do you want to make everybody more centrist? Do you want to make people like each other? You want them to stop being mean to one another? What is the actual objective on the table? And I think where I've landed for myself is really, as a researcher, my job is not to convince people of anything. It's certainly not to persuade anyone, but it's to get people to practice to understand where their own beliefs are coming from and practice figuring out where other people's beliefs are coming from. So it's not the content, it's rather the process. Like that feels like what my job is as a researcher, is to help people figure out not only why they think the things that they believe, but also to figure out how to better ask and elicit from other people why they believe what they believe. And I think that that's a much better starting point than coming from, my goal here is to persuade you or to change your mind.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective, because one of the things when I do this, and I'll often kind of start with things like misperceptions, and people say like, okay, but it's not all misperceptions. And I'll say, that's right. And so there's a great line that Danielle Allen has quoted in some of her work, and it's basically that, I'm going to get it wrong, but something like democracy is a great roar, right? And that's part of it, and that contestation is kind of at the heart of democracy, and you're not going to get rid of it, right? It's okay to disagree, right? The goal is not to eliminate disagreement. I tell people, I like to help you learn how to disagree better, right? And be able to handle that conflict better. Because I think if you can handle that conflict better, right, you understand that is the challenge of the modern age in many ways, right? Living in a diverse, plural society is really hard. Functionally, it has never happened before this in world history, right? So sometimes I have arguments with friends. This is the kind of stuff academics argue about, right? As is the Austro-Hungarian Empire the world's first multi-ethnic society? Never mind. I was going to tell a personal anecdote that's not relevant. You can ask me later what it was. it's very, very dorky. But, we could have some, debate about this, but like in many ways you can sort of think that, the last few decades in the US, and we could maybe pick on a couple of other countries, right, or pick out a couple of other countries, are the first time this has kind of ever happened. It's not easy, right? So that it's about thinking about how you can manage some of that disagreement in an effective way so that you understand what the stakes of things are on the table and you can have a well-reasoned and well-articulated debate.
Yeah, I think my intuitions are similar to both of yours in the sense that when I'm talking about reducing polarization, I'm talking about reducing affective polarization, is just like sheer dislike or hatred for other groups. I'm not actually trying to convince them to believe a certain policy. So I think that, I'll go to the first panel, I use the word pluralism a lot. And I think like that is a fundamental part of modern society, and certainly this one, is that you have to get people, and this is what I try to underscore in my class when I teach, is that we have an incredibly diverse student body. I teach intro psych to like 300 students, and they come from around the world. And most of them don't even care or understand American politics. So this is even, the issue of American politics isn't even on their radar in a real way. But they come from a wide variety of ethnic, religious, national backgrounds, different socioeconomic classes, and a wide variety of perspectives. And so I want people to be more open-minded to managing diverse perspectives and people different than them, because I think that's healthy for society and necessary for society. And then to avoid having those erupt into violent conflict, I think would be like an ultimate goal as a minimum. Ideally, it would be great if we had a deeper understanding of people and their differences and learn to respect them and embrace some of the things that we could come to agree on and enrich our own thinking and maybe evolve how we see the world. So I think those are my ultimate goals. With one exception, I also study misinformation and conspiracy theories. And I think that the epistemic issue about what is truth is one where, as a scientist, I feel like I have a duty to help people understand what's true and to understand what barriers come between themselves psychologically and understanding that truth. And so a lot of my research in the last 8 years has been, why do people hang on to false beliefs? Because they can be incredibly harmful for us as a society, and I think like the type of people who are in this room are well equipped to try to help people understand what's true. We have expertise, I think, that's important to share. Like I would much rather have, when CNN has a panel to discuss something about the issues you talked about, I would like to have experts on that panel. That's actually one thing I thought that was good during COVID, was I saw the nighttime news channels bring on experts instead of just pundits who are essentially politicians waiting between administrations. So I do think that there's a lot of utility in having people who have a depth of knowledge bring those on. And I do think it's really important for us to understand why people are attracted to misinformation, conspiracies, conspiratorial communities, and then what we can do to help them grapple with big truths. One big one that's hanging over all of us, a big one that concerns me, I've been studying, is like climate change. How do you get people to believe that climate change is really happening? Because it turns out that a lot of people are clinging to the belief that it's not, despite tons of evidence to the contrary. And so it's a really important issue. Before you can decide what to do on it, I think there's actually really good debates about, like, there's conservative solutions to it, liberal solutions. But before you can even have that debate about how you talk to different communities and have those solutions, you have to start with a ground truth of what the state of the universe is to have germane discussions about what we do about it.
It's probably worth saying that not everything has a ground truth, though. I mean, some things are just based in values and beliefs and preferences, and those are also at the heart of so many moral issues in our political lives, and that's kind of the problem. I know Kellyanne Conway gets a lot of grief for what was it, alternative facts? Was that the phrase?
Yeah.
But I think that she put her finger on something really important, which is that sometimes these things that are just beliefs and preferences come to take on the epistemic status of facts. That is that they feel fact-like to us, and that's incredibly powerful. And one of the things that I think, as a society we should be doing is helping people understand how to pull those things apart, what those things are that do have some ground truth versus what those things are that come from places that are values and opinions, and people are entitled to have those and they're entitled to disagree, but I do think those kinds of conversations are going to have to be different, and the best thing that we can do, or specifically as educators, is teach people how to interrogate the origins of those. and which class they fall into, whether there's something that it's actually fact-like or if it's just elevated to feel fact-like in that moment. Now I'm curious what you two think.
No, I think that's really great. And, you know, one of the things I'm not allowed to tell you who I talked to, but I talked to people, you know, we'll say administrators at a private university located on the East Coast in a major metropolitan area. You can fill in the blank of which one that might have been, about, you know, some of the stuff that happened on campus. And the question that I started with was like, what values did you want to inculcate with the way you thought about protest and how you responded to them? And they were like, and it wasn't they didn't give a great answer. Right, and I think that's one of the things that, that is, I think about this especially as I think about how to do this with students and how to train them in this, is that, you know, thinking about okay, well, what are the kind of core values that you want to articulate and think about, and helping you learn to articulate those. And part of that is sort of okay, well, what does have some ground truth and what is just, you know, these things you can feel very passionately about, but are more about these kind of underlying moral issues, helping, I think, as I think about what we do in the classroom, that's something I want to help students do, is learn to think through how you follow through an argument, learn to think about evaluating evidence, because look, at the end of the day, students will forget the specific things you teach them about, you know, this paper or that theory, right? But they might learn and hold on to some of these broader things I think are really valuable things that are supposed to be the kind of hallmarks of an education.
Yeah, the education part, I'll pick up on that. So I have a stepson, and by the time he was 9 or 10, his school was teaching him the difference between opinion and fact. And it was actually really important because I don't remember ever being taught that distinction, and it took me a long time, probably into my 20s, before I realized the difference between the editorial page and the investigative journalism. And I remember having conversations with family members who are grown adults in their 30s and 40s who didn't know that distinction. And so I think that we need to do a lot better with civic education around understanding where these distinctions exist, giving people the skills to understand them, to marking them more carefully when our news agencies create content, so that people can understand it. Because people are not stupid, they're smart, they can pick up tone. They get the editorial tone, whether it's left-leaning or right-leaning, right away. And if they then confuse the fact-based reporting with the tone that they're reading that's editorialized, then they distrust the source. And once they tune out of the source, then they won't trust anything from that source anymore. And so I think that we have to make it very clear when we're editorializing and when we're presenting fact-based content, because if those get confused in an audience's mind, they're gonna lose faith in us. And I think that's something that's happened with academics and our institutions, which are under heavy assault right now. I'm getting texts from colleagues this morning about Columbia just lost $400 million in funding. And part of it is because that there's an entire segment of this country that's lost faith in our institutions and is struggling to understand where there's editorializing coming from the institutions and their faculty and their students, and protest and what that means, separate from the fact-finding mission of these institutions. And I think that's a real challenge for us to be able to communicate those and demarcate them in effective ways. And I don't know if I don't have an answer to that, but I think that's a big problem that we haven't grappled with. And it trickles all the way down to children's education in primary school, all the way up to higher education and how we express ourselves at these institutions.
And not just higher education, but also our political elites.
Yep.
Elected officials probably need to learn this lesson better than anybody.
Yeah. Or they willfully ignore the distinction for political ends is probably
right,
what
and
happens.
we should figure out how to make it politically costly for them to continue to do that.
No, I agree.
One goal that I've heard repeated throughout this panel is better understanding of others, finding ways to foster that. So one of the questions I think, this is a very interesting, challenging question. It says, I have some friends and family who regularly share provocative political social media posts without any serious engagement of the ideas. They appear more as signaling to their crowd than inviting discussion. Is it ever worth engaging on these posts with other perspectives? Is it best to ignore, or perhaps some other option? Anyone who wants to take a stab at that?
To you, Matt.
Yeah, so this is something that like, I've actually even had like students ask me this, and one of the things that I'll say is that I'm not sure the right way to engage someone is to engage them online, because it tends to kind of foster that same sort of kind of spiral. But the way I might approach it is I might try to, because and part of the other problem with social media, it's also public, right? And people are kind of choosing to present a particular kind of image there. And so I might approach them offline and say like, hey, I want to talk to you about, this, and to try and, couch, it's not a judgmental thing, but I want to understand like what your motivation for doing this and what you're, kind of hoping to achieve. And, you're probably not going to be able to get rid of it altogether, but I think you might be able to plant the seed of like, maybe that's not a super productive behavior, and to try and get them to think a little bit more critically about that sort of behavior, right? And I think doing that also in a way, one of the other things I learned about doing this is that it's really important to not seem judgmental to people when you're doing this, because as Jay said, people pick up on tone really quickly. And one of the striking things when I did work with in-person samples, so you actually get to talk to people at the end of the discussion, was that a lot of people were like, oh, I was so worried this was gonna be a test and you were gonna judge me at the end of it. I'm like, no, that's really not the point, right? Because I think a lot of people feel like that people in these kinds of roles tend to judge them a lot. So I think doing it in a constructive way maybe would help that kind of go a little bit better.
Yeah, for me, it comes down a little bit to what your goal is and how much time you have. I used to try engaging with people online about these things. I learned that it often accomplished nothing and sometimes up-escalated the conflict, as Matt suggested. So I find that I prefer, if I'm gonna have a discussion with people, to almost always do it in person or offline, like a real debate, which I enjoy. And I'll give you an example of this. I have this dynamic with my brother. We disagree very strongly politically. And we found that like debating it online was not helpful, but when we're together for family holidays, we enjoy debating in person. And it turns out once we work through things, there's some things we're gonna disagree on, but we actually sometimes have a lot of common ground once we sort past our stereotyped view of one another and get to actual like policy issues. For example, I showed up once to stay at his house, and he's in Canada, but he's a big gun enthusiast. He had a shirt on that was made of guns, and it said, "No compromise." And so it sounds like somebody who's not willing to compromise on gun issues. But once we had a drink and started talking, it turns out that he had almost exact same set of policy prescriptions I would have, which is background checks, regulation of automatic weapons, and all these things. He just wants the right to own them and use them, having passed those things. And I actually really didn't have very many objections. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't buy them myself, but I had no objections to that. But if you saw his shirt and the way he was presenting himself to the world, it was very different from the nuance that he had once you got in a conversation with him. So if he had shared something like that on social media, I probably would have reacted, he would have saw my first pass reaction and it would have escalated. But in person, you can kind of slowly work through it and get to a point where you understand when someone actually stands on something. And the conversation was actually really interesting for both of us because it was pretty thoughtful and nuanced and engaged. And a lot of people want to have those conversations. And so our mom hates it when we get together for holidays and talk about this because she doesn't like that. So we kind of have ground rules. Don't engage her. But as long as we're in another room, she lets us do it and we actually enjoy it. And so even if we come to a lack of agreement, but we do not enjoy it when it's online. So the medium, I think, matters a lot. And creating a context where you can do it where you're both enjoying it and one person's not miserable the whole time is really critical. Just browbeating someone is probably going to get you nowhere.
No, I'm good.
Okay. So I like this question because it gets back to I think the heart of this panel. Why is it so hard to disagree? I like this question because there are times where, and you all have said this, where you just will disagree with a person. And I would actually push it further related to this question. There's a time where you feel like you need to judge this person. And so this question is, we often talk about how important it is to have civil disagreements with those we disagree with. We are also told not to judge the morality based on their positions. At what point does civility become normalization of immoral opinions? I think that's a great question. There are times where you fully understand the person. In fact, because you understand them so well, you realize not only do you disagree, but you actually, as I said at the beginning of this, you feel like they're doing something totally immoral. How do you grapple with those kind of situations? Take it whatever domain you want, politics or outside of that. How do you deal with these situations where it's not an issue of misunderstanding, you fully understand what the person's position is, you just feel like they are immoral, it's evil, and it's wrong. What do you do in those kind of situations? Assuming the option is not just walk away or, avoid it. That's too easy.
So I'll start by sharing an anecdote. So I gave a talk with, kind of similar things, and this woman came up and asked a question, and she said, Professor Levendusky, this is great, but, my child is trans, and I'm not going to have a civil conversation with a transphobe. And I said, well, I appreciate that, and that's not the point of this, right? But I think sometimes being willing to have that conversation when we say, here's why what you're saying about my child and the kind of rhetoric you're doing is really causing a lot of harm. And I need you to hear and understand that so that you have to confront what you are doing to this, right? And be forced to kind of live with the reality of that, right? And that's not going to be an easy conversation, right? But that's an important conversation. And so when I think about this, I tend to think about civility, right? Which people often very falsely equate with politesse. It's not. I think the best book on this is by two rhetoricians, Keith and Danish, called, I think it's The Boundaries of Obligation, right? And so they talk about what civility means. The definition I really like is that you treat everyone as a political equal, right? So I think, like Danielle, sorry to go back to Danielle Allen again, she's a theorist I like a lot. She has a really great, line in this, she's like, that's the most important insight in the Declaration, is that the reason we're all political equals is that we know best what will be best for us, right? So I think the way in which I think about how, or the set of people with you should engage with, are the people who are treating you and your arguments as if you have a legitimate right to be there. And if people are respecting that, I think you can work within those constraints and have a conversation where you can disagree, but to the extent that they don't, then I think that's not a productive conversation, and that's not a space in which I encourage people to engage.
I can build on that. I'll talk about a study that was done by Emily Kubin, not by my lab, that I thought was really creative in this way. They ran a couple studies first, asking people what they thought would gain them respect in these types of conversations. And people assume that facts will gain you respect, overwhelmingly. Survey after survey finds that people think that if you use facts, that's gonna gain people, your political opponents will have to then listen to what you're saying, which was part of the earlier question we had. But then they ran studies and they had people talk, kind of engage in crosstalk on issues of abortion or trans issues. And what they found is that facts didn't really help you earn respect, and in fact didn't even lead people to see you as more rational. What helped was sharing a personal experience, because you can't really deny someone's personal experience. And if you're talking about how this affects you or someone in your family, or how some policy impacted you in some way, it turns out that really resonates with even people who disagree with you very strongly on that issue, and they kind of pause and open their mind, and they actually see you as more rational for holding the position that you have once they understand how it impacts you. So I'm not saying that anybody has a duty to share their personal experiences with somebody who's different than them on a moral issue. It might be too upsetting for you. You might not have the bandwidth or the emotional, strength to do it at that moment. But the research suggests that if you're able to do it, it can give them pause, it can improve how they see you, and it can help them think twice about that issue and understand its impact on people a bit more. You have to understand that a lot of people are kind of now in little segmented communities and echo chambers, and they're not necessarily hearing these experiences from people in their community, people they know, people they trust. And these experiences, when they do hear them, really seem to resonate with them.
I think there's also something to be said about just propagating a norm of listening from within a group. So this is, again, coming back to elites and not shutting other people down or having these sort of, dialectical ways of thinking about the other, but also just, I hadn't heard that definition of civility, and that really, really resonates with me. I think that for some people, it is their job to do these things. It's not necessarily our jobs to be out there convincing other people, but for people who are in politics, people who are thought leaders, people who are, they have a responsibility to do exactly these exercises. But then I also think that, to your point, at some point, yeah, you do walk away. You're not going to win them all.
think we have time for one more question. I'm going to modify this question, though. You all have mentioned how we obviously think in group terms. I have a friend, one of my closest friends here. We disagree incredibly on political issues, but I love him. He's a good friend. And what's interesting is that I get along well with him. When we talk about the issues, sometimes we agree, but I can't stand I won't tell you the person, but the leader of his preferred political party. And I find that whenever we start focusing on like the elites, the leadership, that's where our friction really arises. It's not our issue, our one-on-one issues or our dynamics. And I feel like this is a thing a lot of people are struggling with now. This is related to the question. How can we have these conversations where you don't really have a problem even with the person in front of you and what they're saying, but it's almost like their allegiances. And the minute you try to direct any kind of doubt or negativity towards those allegiances, they kind of shut down. It's almost like they become a different person. Like how do you handle those kind of tough situations? That's our final question, I think. So.
Shall I? My understanding is that actually, for most people, they don't love their political leaders, or when they do, they still take issues with them on some issues. And I think that there's some evidence to indicate that if you don't know anything else about a person except for their political partisanship, all the stereotypes are going to fill in all the gaps. But the second they start to give you a more nuanced view of their views, even if they support a particular politician, that it softens you to them because you understand that they are more complex than just a party stereotype. And moreover, the more you're asked to think of more and more and more exemplars from a particular party, you might start at the most extremes because that's the first person who comes to mind, but if you're forced to think of, say, like the 20th person that you know who belongs to that party, it moderates your representation because you recognize that there's some distribution of people. Not all of the people in the party are substitutable for one another. My understanding is that it's not very often, at least with the exception of a few hot button, high profile issues, most people actually don't have 100% perfect party alignment with their party's platform at all, right? That's actually quite rare.
Super rare.
Yeah, so I think that the more that people understand that, you can get past okay, you voted for this person, but what are your beliefs if the goal is to have a relationship with that particular person?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say something actually really similar, and that's that you don't have any ability to control what Donald Trump, Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden, Mitch McConnell, fill in the blank things. Sorry if you thought you did, but you don't. Right? And so, sometimes when people ask me these sorts of questions, I say something similar like, take it down to something where you can actually control and think about that person and their beliefs, because that's who you're having the relationship with. It's not with those national, political figures, and that thinking about them rather than the political elites will do that. And that's the other advice I give to people is that I actually think one of the great tragedies of the last couple of decades politically has been that we have come to think of politics as being what happens in Washington, D.C. If you go back and read the Federalist Papers, right, it is fundamentally a complete opposite of the way the system was set up to work. This was a system that was set up to decentralize power and to put lots of decisions into the hands of state and local officials, and lots of stuff still happens there, right? Lots of things that people really care a lot about. Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Nancy Pelosi, all those people can do very little to affect issues about, say, policing. Like, yeah, they can control who gets some grants and who gets extra COPS funding, which is the unfortunate name for its community-orienting policing and service grants. Like those sorts of things are what they can control. But all of those decisions are made at the state and local level. So to the extent that you're passionate about those things, get involved in state and local issues, because it's much easier to have an impact and an effect there. And there are real things that matter that happen at those levels, right? I often try to discourage, even, someone used to run a program to train people to go into government service. At first I was like, oh, I want everyone to go to DC, and then after 3 months I was like, absolutely not, right? And trying to move students in exactly the other direction, because I just think there's a lot more that can be done there, and in a much more productive fashion, typically.
Yeah, I'll add one thing is that the data I've seen is that political elites tend to be more extreme than the average voters from their party. And I think this is especially true currently of the Republican elites. You're nodding. I was making sure I had that right. And so you have to understand that the average person's views are not synonymous, if those members of voting members of those party are not synonymous with the elites. And I think that we need a language and a way of talking and thinking that separates the elites from the regular voters, because a lot of people's perceptions, I'm almost certain of it with Mina's research, with why our perceptions of regular people are so distorted is because we're generating them based on the behavior and expressions of elites that we're seeing in the media and in the news and on social media. And then we're generalizing it to regular citizens, and they're not matching up very well. And therefore, we're treating our neighbors very poorly. And I think that it's really fundamental that we start to talk in a way that distinguishes them. And I'll just give you a very short personal experience. I had some research of mine that analyzed, I gave this a polarization dictionary, measured social media posts by members of Congress in the last 4 years, 6 years, and the New York Times data staff ran it, and they had a front page story on it, analyzing it over the last, how our elites are using more polarized rhetoric, and how that led into the January 6th decision for some of them not to vote to certify the election. And I showed it to my mother-in-law, who's a Republican, who was there, and she read the story, and she really didn't like it because the way the story was framed was about the rhetoric and behavior of Republicans. But what she interpreted as if it was about Republicans in general, but it was just talking about really this subset of Republican members of Congress, and it was really a subset of them who voted or did not vote to certify the election. Many of them did vote in that party to certify the election. And so the language that we have as if Republican means synonymous with her, my mother-in-law, and Marjorie Taylor Greene or something like that, and they hold almost very few beliefs in common, is a problem, because she took the article as offensive to her. Once I explained that it wasn't about actual Republican voters, she had no problem with it at all. And it was just the language that we use. We don't have different terms. In this room, we have a panel on elites, but regular citizens don't hear that when they read our discussions or aren't thinking about it. And it makes it hard. These things get muddy, and they can be offensive and upsetting for people.
Thank you. I just want to thank everyone for attending our panel, and hopefully a round of applause for our speakers here. Thank you.